Hello, and welcome to Channel Zero TV with John and John. I'm John,
And I'm John.
and tonight we're going to go back a bit. In fact, we're going to go back over 120 years to 1899, one of the first early silent pictures by the director George Milius. This is a political picture, actually, not a fantasy picture that Milius is associated with, on the then contemporary Dreyfus Affair. John, you want to talk a little bit about what people are about to watch?
Yes, this is a very, very rare chapter in a serial. He actually, one of the first serials ever made for theatrical consumption wasn't an action adventure thing or a damsel in distress thing. It was what we would guess called today almost like a mini series based on a sort of docudrama recreation of the entire Dreyfus Affair from the time of his arrest, his trial, his exile to Devil's Island, his retrial, the whole thing, I believe, played out to about 11 episodes. And Méliès took it upon himself to play it very straight and to not editorialize on anything.
Okay, well, we'll be back afterwards to talk about the filmmaker and the subject of the film. Okay, so many viewers may be most familiar with Méliès's work and his fantasy films, notably Earth to the Moon. But this was a bit of a departure, although you could still see some of his special effects work, such as that lightning storm. But John, do you want to sort of talk about the director and how important a role he played in early cinema?
Yeah, Méliès created cinema. He created modern cinema. I think literally he is the first man to sit out there in the audience and look at whatever was being projected on that screen. And it was probably just like Dancing Girls or trains pulling into the station or the Tsar of Russia reviewing the troops in Paris, and immediately saw that as an art form. He immediately perceived that film as a unique and independent art form unto itself. He immediately began thinking in terms of, okay, well, if I'm going to start making films, Who's going to be out in the audience? What are they going to get out of it? And from there, I firmly believe he leaped to, well, I need to be making films about real topics, but also I need to make films that are entirely fictional in nature. And thankfully, he could draw on a huge bank of experience and skill because he had been a very accomplished stage magician prior to that in the evolution of his films. But he invented all sorts of techniques, lap dissolves, stop motion effect, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Dozens and dozens of things all came out of this one very, very prolific filmmaker who was working in the 19th century.
When this affair took place at the turn of the 19th century. But just sticking with the director for a while, the role he played as a stage magician. If you've ever seen the movie The Prestige, you'll get a sense of what it was like to go to a magic show back in the 19th century. This is where kind of wondrous illusions were played out before very large audiences. So some techniques for tricking the eye and fooling the audience were in place. I think what he did was to figure out ways to make those work on screen and then expand it to create a whole gigantic palette of new ways to show people things they'd never seen before.
Right. I mean, he invented cinema storytelling single-handedly. He was editing film. He was editing to create, a certain tempo, all of it. He is such a consequent man in the outset of cinema. It simply cannot be understated. And I'm absolutely fascinated that one of the first real serials ever made wasn't, again, an action adventure thing. It was a very straight up docudrama about this famous political scandal in France.
Being French, he had the French fantasy tradition, notably of Jules Verne, to draw upon. But here he was drawing on contemporary events, and we should just describe the Dreyfus Affair for folks who are unfamiliar with it, because this film was made really at the peak of the controversy. Dreyfus was a French soldier of Jewish background who was framed for spilling French military secrets to the Germans. In fact, he had done nothing of the kind. It was another French officer, Esterhazy, who had betrayed the country. But Esterhazy was a Christian and Dreyfus a Jew. And so he was convicted, sentenced, sent to Devil's Island, as sort of depicted in this picture. In 1899 is when he came back because a group of French intellectuals, most famous of which was Émile Zola, had accused the French military and by extension the French government of covering up Esterhazy's crime and trying to pin it on Dreyfus. And so he was brought back for a retrial, which is what this film was depicting, although the story itself continued on for many years afterwards.
Oh yeah, no, there were appeals to higher courts. I mean, at the height of this, the mere mention of Dreyfus's name in a crowd could occasion a riot all of itself. I mean, this is such an incendiary moment in both French history, but also just literally in world history. I mean, everybody was talking about this.
And we should note it was somewhat depicted in the picture. This was a important moment in the history of the media, the mass media. That fight of the reporters illustrates how newspapers kind of took sides. There was the pro and anti-Dreyfusard press, and they, just like pro and anti-Dreyfusard citizenry of France, which largely divided along conservative and more progressive lines. This was a sharp dividing line that continued for decades. As you said, he was eventually exonerated. In fact, he lost this trial that was depicted on the film. It was only afterwards that he was finally exonerated and reinstated in the military, where he fought in World War I and died in 1935. So his loyalty to France remained unblemished during this whole period. But it also was sort of a wake-up call to what could happen in Europe regarding anti-Semitism. One of the reporters who was covering this trial, Theodor Herzl, was, like Dreyfus, a assimilated Jew who believed in liberty, equality, fraternity, and sort of modernity that a modern world would give Jews a place as a citizen. It was a Dreyfus Affair that taught him that modernity was not going to be a cure for the Jewish question, and caused him to found the Zionist movement, which was based on a book he wrote, actually interesting, a science fiction book. So Israel is probably the only country that was based on a work of science fiction. But this trial had incredible import, and I think it's really a remarkable artifact to see, not just it depicted on film. As I said, there's been other film depictions, but something that was filmed contemporary with the controversy going on.
Oh yeah, Méliès took serious chances here, but so far as we can tell, he played it straight up the middle and just illustrated the facts.
And the film was still banned by the French government afterwards because of its controversial nature. It was really only kind of seen decades later. And now it's being seen over 100 years later by you. So I'm glad you were able to join us for this special unearthing, and that you'll join us next time for another episode of Channel Zero TV. Until then, I'm John,
And I'm John.
and we'll catch you next time.